Led by the US, Western support and weapons have been central to Israel's genocide in Gaza. UK and EU relations with Israel remain essentially unchanged despite the war. So is this complicity? And could there be legal consequences for Western nations and their leaders? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The contrast on Saturday could not be more stark. More Israeli attacks, killing more Palestinians in Gaza, while European diplomats met in plush surrounds in Copenhagen to discuss the war. The outcome? More words, no action. Israel's genocide is waged largely with weapons made and supplied by Western nations. The US is the biggest donor, but British and EU weaponry is in there too, perhaps reflecting the growing public outrage at the genocide, or maybe worried about their own place in history. Some European leaders have now become more critical of Israel, yet trade and cooperation deals remain unchanged. So what does international law say about complicity in genocide? Could there be consequences for Western nations or their leaders? We'll talk to our guests shortly, but first, a report from Joel Evans.
The Israeli military is pushing ahead with its offensive to seize Gaza City, armed with Western weapons. As more Palestinians were being killed in Gaza, EU foreign ministers gathered in Copenhagen on Saturday. The bloc has failed to take a united position on Israel's war. Foreign policy decisions must be unanimous, but opposition from Israel's allies, including Germany and Hungary, mean the 27-member bloc has taken no action against it.
It's clear that member states disagree on how to get Israeli government to change course. The options are clear and remain on the table. We have presented an option paper, but the problem is that not all EU member states are on board.
Israel's trade agreement with the EU, vital to its economy, remains in place, despite an investigation finding Israel had breached its human rights obligations. In Copenhagen, Palestinian solidarity protesters gathered outside the conference venue to demand their leaders act.
We want all the EU countries, all the EU leaders to take action and to do as much as possible, as much as they can, to stop this genocide. And what they can do is they can make sanctions on Israel.
We're demanding they are making sanctions, actual real sanctions against Israel, who's committing a genocide at the moment. It's not okay that they are giving them special possibilities for trade and sending arms for Israel.
Thank you,
President. The UK is among countries that says it will recognise Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly in September. While the government has become more vocal in its criticism of Israel, it continues to cooperate with its ally. British-made parts for F-35 fighter jets end up in Israeli warplanes, and the Royal Air Force continues to conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering flights over Gaza. Israel's biggest ally, the US, has been unwavering in its support. Earlier this year, it approved the sale of an additional $7.4 billion in weapons to Israel, weapons that have played a central role in the genocide and destruction of Gaza. Political and military support, complicity, as well as inaction from Western governments mean that for Palestinians trapped in Gaza, the horror and hunger continues. Their homes reduced to rubble and nowhere left to turn. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From London, Ontario, we're joined by Michael Lynk, a Professor Emeritus of Law at Western University and the former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. From Paphos, Cyprus, we're joined by Yara Hawari, the co-director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She focuses on global policy on Palestine, international law and human rights. And joining us from Belém in Brazil is Ralph Wilde, a professor of international law at University College London. He represented the Arab League, Bolivia and the Palestinian Human Rights Commission at the International Court of Justice at International Criminal Court, but will be speaking with us today in a personal capacity. A warm welcome to you all. Michael, let's start with you. What does international law say about individual states' obligations when another state, an ally, is in breach of international law, is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and plausibly genocide? Is inaction just as bad as action in the eyes of the law?
All of our international architecture for a law since 1945 is built upon the concept of individual and collective responsibility in order to bring to an end atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and obviously genocide as well. We can look at the 1948 Genocide Convention, which talks about complicity. We can talk about the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which talk about the need for joint action to stop other countries from violating the terms of the laws of war and occupation. And obviously the 1998 Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, raises the issue of with respect to responsibility to protect. And of course, we have the 2005 resolution that was adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly, now 20 years old, called Responsibility to Protect, which lays out the joint actions that members of the United Nations are to take when there is a serious breach of international law occurring anywhere in the world.
Yara, picking up on what Michael was saying, why are states, particularly European ones right now, not filling their obligations under international law?
Well, I think the very obvious answer to that is because of their complicity in the genocide in Gaza. And I think one of the reasons why the genocide in Gaza has received so much attention worldwide, aside from the massive scale of destruction and killing, is the fact that so many countries are complicit in it. And people around the world are uncovering the levels of complicity, which are often quite shocking. And I think, most people know that the US is an active partner in the genocide, but contrary to European claims to moral superiority, it's not only the US. Europe is actually Israel's largest trading partner in the world. And yet that trade, by and large, has continued throughout the genocide. And if that wasn't bad enough, European countries are also still selling arms and surveillance technologies to Israel. So there is a deep level of complicity here. And I think with the recognition that a genocide is taking place, states then have to recognize that they have been in breach of international law all along and have actually been aiding and abetting that genocide. And so political leaders around the world might actually face charges under international law, might face attempts to bring them to The Hague, as we're seeing already those attempts and efforts underway. So I think people are becoming very worried, especially politicians, about the level of complicity that they have presided over.
Ralph, how is complicity defined under international law? Is there a criteria?
So we have to acknowledge that Israel is violating all the fundamental rules of international law in both the conduct of its presence, not only in Gaza, but also the West Bank. That's a violation of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. It's also an unlawful use of force. It's an aggression. Those are two of the fundamental areas of international law being breached by Israel. But also, Israel is breaching fundamental rules of international law in the way that it's treating the Palestinian people. Apartheid, racial discrimination generally, serious violations of the laws of war, including, of course, using starvation as a weapon of war, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, when these fundamental rules of international law are violated, all other states are in a special position that they would not be in otherwise. They themselves have special legal obligations essentially to suppress, to end these violations. And that's at the heart of the concept of the responsibility to protect. So they do not have the discretion to pick and choose what actions they take in this context that they would have, discretion they would have in other circumstances. And that essentially in this context means two things. Firstly, a positive obligation to take all steps within their power to end Israel's violations, not just of the way it treats the Palestinian people, not just in relation to war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, racial discrimination, apartheid, but also in the very exercise of domination over Gaza and the West Bank in and of itself, regardless of the way that it's conducted. In order to do that, to discharge that duty, to end that, necessarily they have to take actions to sever trade relations with Israel entirely. Moreover, of course, they have to end any of the positive support that they give to Israel. They have a positive duty to end any actions which give any support whatsoever, regardless of the motivations for that support. It doesn't matter that states may say, we're doing this to help Israel insofar as it's acting lawfully, because the nature of Israel's actions are such that it is impossible to disaggregate support that might be put to some lawful purpose and support that will be used to commit one or more of these fundamental violations of international law. So because of that, states are legally required to end all of the support that they give to Israel, including the support that was outlined earlier, arms, being involved in the supply chain of arms, sharing military intelligence, etc.
Okay, before we talk about why that isn't happening, Michael, what repercussions could states and their leaders face in future for not fulfilling their obligations under international law? Are there legal precedents? How can state complicity be brought to justice?
Complicity in genocide, for example, is one of the very first articles in the 1948 Genocide Convention. So the active support of genocide by supplying arms and other means of intelligence and military warfare to Israel would obviously be a breach with respect to complicity. The question is also raised as to whether or not corporations, which continue to aid Israel by supplying military hardware or other essential means to continue both the war and the genocide in Gaza, as well as its unlawful occupation, could well make corporations complicit as well. We know that there were complicity trials in the aftermath of the Second World War in Nuremberg for German industrialists who were supplying the means of war to the Third Reich. So those are issues. Whether or not a court would then go beyond that to investigate countries that were, in fact, folded their arms and didn't do anything in the face of what is now an active genocide is yet another question that hasn't really been tested in international law with respect to being a passive bystander, where you could have done something with regards to this. And then the question also arises as whether or not a court such as the International Criminal Court would actually have the capacity to be able to go after those sorts of countries. But remember now that there is litigation ongoing at the International Court of Justice between Nicaragua and Germany that's challenging Germany's supply of weapons to Israel during this genocide. Germany is the second largest arms supplier to Israel after the United States, and it has maintained its levels of arms throughout most of this almost two-year-old war.
Yara, we're talking about state complicity. What about individual complicity? Can it be applied to individual citizens as well as states? For example, dual nationals who fought with the Israeli army. Should states be prosecuting citizens who've gone to fight in Gaza?
I think it certainly can be applied to individuals, and we've seen efforts, citizen efforts and civil society efforts to do just that, to target individuals who are dual nationals, who have gone to take part in the genocidal violence in Gaza. I think at this moment it's very unlikely to see that taken up on a state level, precisely because of the state complicity that we have just mentioned, that it would set then a precedence for politicians at home who've presided over the trade of arms, the continued diplomatic support to the Israeli regime. So I think those efforts will continue very much on a civil society level and an activist level. But I think it remains crucially important to look at those individuals, because I think it acts as a deterrence. Because if people are charged with, taking part in war crimes or in acts of genocide abroad, I think that could serve as a really powerful deterrence for future atrocities and war crimes.
Ralph, what does all of this mean for the concept of international law? If it can be flouted so flagrantly with little to no repercussions, what use is it? Why should anyone have any trust in it?
Well, that's the question. And the legitimacy of the international legal system is at stake in the unwillingness of states to discharge the duties that they have to suppress these fundamental violations of international law. And I would just add on the point of soldiers that this positive duty to suppress Israel's violations of international law requires all states to take action against non-state actors within their jurisdictions, individuals, corporations, universities, in order to ensure that they do not take any action which enables these violations. So indeed, that means that all states should be taking action to prevent their nationals from going to serve in the Israeli armed forces. And they are breaching their obligations of suppression in failing to take such action.
Let's talk for a moment then about why they're failing to take such action. Michael, the EU in particular, can EU member states continue to hide behind this argument that it's difficult to reach collective decisions, that pro-Israeli countries like Germany and Hungary can block action, and that becomes, it would seem, the EU's default position? Is there any legal justification for that? And what about the EU institutions themselves and their failure to act? Where does the Commission stand legally? Does it not have, I think we've established that it has a legal and moral duty to act. Does its failure to do so make the EU Commission directly complicit?
I'm afraid to say that EU policy and Commission policy towards its relationships with Israel has never been more incoherent than it is now. It has a long-standing association agreement with Israel. It has a number of countries who supply arms to Israel. It has a free trade agreement with Israel. All of these are substantial tools in the EU toolbox to try to bring this genocide to an end, to try to bring this unlawful occupation to an end, and to try to bring Israel at long last on the right side of international law and international opinion. If I was a leader of a country in Europe that wanted to take more action and yet was stymied by the Germanys or Hungarys of the association, I think I'd be trying to look at other forms of unity with other sorts of like-minded countries, particularly at the UN General Assembly. One idea that's being broached now, and I think this is where progressive liberal EU countries who are very critical of what Israel is doing should be following, is that if there's inaction and paralysis, as there is at the UN Security Council. We saw that last week with the decision or the statement made by 14 of the 15 Security Council members that they endorsed the UN report on famine and called it a man-made famine, and yet left the United States standing by itself. But the U.S. has this veto. We know from history, going back to 1950, that the UN General Assembly has the power under the Uniting for Peace resolution to take action where the Security Council is rendered paralyzed by the veto of one or more members. That was used in Korea. It should be used now. And I think you're going to see debate in the coming months at the General Assembly as to whether or not there's enough political momentum to take decisive action by the UN through a General Assembly resolution to create peacemakers or peacekeepers and to take other more militant action against Israel on the weapons trade and on the economic and investment trade as well. This is a real test for the solidity of the United Nations, whether or not it can wind up faithfully addressing what is the oldest continuous item on the UN agenda. The question of Palestine has been there since April 1947, 78 years now, and we're now further away from a just resolution than ever. Now is the time, more than ever, for the UN General Assembly to take this kind of action, and that's where I think liberal-minded countries in Europe should be joining and leading that kind of initiative.
Yara, to what extent does the recognition of Palestinian statehood by certain European countries and Canada, if that happens at the UN General Assembly in September, somehow get them off the hook as far as complicity is concerned?
Well, I think we have to be quite clear about what we mean when we're talking about the recognition of the Palestinian state. We're talking about recognition in a diplomatic realm. A Palestinian state does not exist on the ground, and unfortunately, what we've seen in recent months, and certainly since the start of the genocide, that European states have sort of pivoted to recognition as a smokescreen and as a distraction from real accountability mechanisms. It's much easier for states to recognize a non-existent state of Palestine than to recognize an actual genocide happening in real time, because the reality is that recognition of the state of Palestine does very little to change the material reality on the ground for Palestinians in Palestine as a whole, but especially for Palestinians in Gaza. And it's being used, as we've seen in the case of the UK and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, it's being used as a threat against the Israeli regime. Keir Starmer said that he would recognize the state of Palestine if the Israeli regime did not agree to a ceasefire by the time of the UN General Assembly meeting, which is absolutely absurd that it's being used in this manner as some kind of bargaining chip, when actually the right of the Palestinian people to sovereignty can't be used in such a manner. But I think it's really crucial to say that, I think for the most part, Palestinians are not interested in recognition of a state that doesn't exist. Rather, they're more interested in the fulfillment of their rights and and reaching a ceasefire as soon as possible, because the situation on the ground in Gaza is so dire.
Ralph, why is it that the EU can impose hefty sanctions on Russia and confiscate Russian assets so easily, but it can't do the same to Israel, despite the ICJ's interim ruling at Israel breaching its human rights obligations under the EU-Israel Association Agreement? I wonder how much of a role lobbying plays in why certain countries have done so little to pressure Israel to stop its genocide. Are there double standards at play here?
So we have to remember that the main issue at the EU level is trade in particular, and EU common trade policy, when it comes to the association agreement with Israel, it does not cover arms. So there is nothing stopping individual EU member states from ending all of the military support that they give to Israel tomorrow. They do not make that decision collectively. On the issue of the trade agreement that they have with Israel, because of that positive obligation they have to suppress Israel's violations of international law in general, not just in relation to the way it treats the Palestinian people, but in its the actions it's taking that are preventing the realization of Palestinian statehood, which are, of course, its very presence in Gaza and the West Bank, and including East Jerusalem in and of itself, which is a violation of Palestinian self-determination. Because they have that special duty, and the only way to discharge that duty is to end completely their trade relations with Israel, they cannot continue to operate that trade agreement. Now, the decision to suspend or terminate the agreement is a common EU collective decision. However, the agreement itself is not as legally significant as these fundamental legal obligations. They are ultimately more important. And if the European Union continues collectively to pursue a legal arrangement that puts the member states in violation of their individual legal obligations to suppress Israel's violations, then they have no choice but to unilaterally depart from their commitments under the agreement. They do not have the freedom to be able to follow the agreement but violate these other obligations. They have to make a choice, and the choice has to be made in favor of ultimately departing from the agreement, because that's what's necessary in order for them to discharge the obligations they have to suppress Israel's violations of international law, obligations which are treated legally as more fundamental than the obligations they have under the European Union.
Michael, we've got about a minute left on the programme. One final question. What's the likelihood of any state or any leader of a state facing a court to answer charges of complicity anytime soon?
I wish that was a possibility. I wish there was a firm attachment to international law, knowing that if you breach it or you're complicit in its breach, that would mean consequences for you legally and politically. I'm afraid we're still at the infancy with respect to a global respect for international law. We're still at a stage where certainly very powerful countries can say international law for thee, but not for me. So I think we're a long ways off with respect to that. And if we are able to get at least the leaders, the Israeli military and political leaders in the dock at the ICC, and any of those who are directly complicit with it, such as the United States, we have made a major, a major step forward. But to expect that others who may be complicit in this, although they certainly do and have breached international law, I'm afraid that's for another war in the future.
There, we must end it. Many thanks indeed. Michael Lynk, Yara Hawari, and Ralph Wilde. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time just by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.